Hey everybody, this is Bill with Quorum. Sorry about the slow start there. We just switched to a new webinar hosting system, and I was just trying to figure out how to get everybody signed in there. So sorry for the delay. Thanks for everybody who's already joined, and hopefully nobody jumped off there. But so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and kick things off. Again, today's meeting's about DR planning. And it goes to the question. I mean, a lot of people at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year, review their DR plan, and the question arises is kind of, what else is, and aside from having a really good backup software, what are the other parts of having a really good DR plan? What else needs to be considered? Are there any, what tests need to be run to make sure that your action that you're going to be ready in case of any event. So I want to turn the cards over, especially since we're getting kicked off a little late here, right away to Gabriel, who's our VP of Technology, and he's going to walk through this presentation. If there's any specific questions or topics or things that you wanted to see during the presentation, you're welcome to chat that over at any time. And during the presentation, if you have any questions about what Gabe's saying, feel free to raise those as well, and we'll address as much as we can during the time. Without further ado, if you can take it away, that'd be great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Can you change me so that I am a host or someone who can share my screen, please?
Yes, you should be able to now.
Nope.
All right, how about now?
There we go. There, can you see that okay?
I can, thanks. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm just getting used to our new system here, so thanks everyone.
No worries. Thanks for everybody for joining. What we're going to talk about today is why disaster planning is important, how we're going to attack it, how we're going to address it. So the first thing we want for disaster planning is you want to make sure you're minimizing disruption. You want to make sure you're minimizing the impact of money. And that's going to be the whole focus on how we go through this to make sure it's efficient, it's not taking all of the IT person's time, and it's effective. So the essential elements of a disaster recovery plan, the first thing you need to focus on is building your business criteria. So the IT department normally can come in and look at a server and they can say, oh, I can have this back up in 2 hours. But the actual business impact of that is not how fast the IT person can manage it, but what the needs of the people that are using that server are. I give you the example of payroll. Well, payroll on a Monday morning might not be a bad thing unless it's the last day of the month, and then it's a critical server. So understanding how the business impacts of the servers you're protecting is really kind of the top-notch piece you need for that. The second one, and I list this, and everyone kind of shakes their head at this or goes, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to worry about that part, is the LAN-WAN diagram. The LAN-WAN diagram is critical to your disaster recovery plan, because if you don't have an up-to-date LAN-WAN diagram and you don't know all of the pieces in your network, inevitably the thing you're not planning for is what's going to fail. And that has to go all the way from your network connections, your switches, your routers, your SANs, all of those things should be listed in there so that you can go through your criteria and you can say, okay, if this fails, what do I do? And then, of course, last but not least is your testing and your success criteria. So how do you know that your DR tests are successful? And that's going to come into, user acceptance testing, creating scenarios to go through. And so these are the parts of a disaster recovery plan that we really want to focus on. The 5 common causes of a business disaster. have changed a little bit over the last couple of years, but number one is still user error. Somebody did something that caused the disaster. Whether it's, the overused example of putting a coffee on the server and having it spill, or tripping over a power cable and yanking out the power for the rack. User error is still the number one critical thing, but cyber threats, namely ransomware, is quickly climbing to number two, whereas hardware and power outages used to be a higher cause. And then, of course, the bottom of the list, but really the most impactful, is a natural disaster. And so we want to talk about these causes of what we're planning, and they're going to help us set our criteria for our how do we address strategies. So let's talk a little bit about user error. A good example is in 2017, Amazon's whole AWS went down because somebody made a typo in an update that they were doing, and it was down for hours. And it took a lot of work and a lot of money cost with a typo. Password management, they say, is the number one way hackers get into a company, which is absolutely true, but typically it's from phishing or spear phishing, catfishing, however you want to call it. But they're targeting their attacks to get somebody to give them that password. It's not that they're just brute force attacking the passwords, although that does happen. Most typically, someone called you or sent you an email and you gave them the password. Construction, digging up a cable of fiber, happens all the time. And that's a user error, but it's outside of your control because it's someone else outside of your managed area that affected that disaster. And then, of course, software bugs. In 2021, Facebook installed an auditing tool to go through and audit their servers and just do kind of inventory IT auditing. It was supposed to be a minor thing, and it actually took them down for 6 hours because the tool was querying everything, and it was on some kind of loop and causing a failure. Let's talk about ransomware. So ransomware is a $20 billion industry as of last year. I guess it's last year now. As of this year, it was last year. And 64% of the attacks were through a vendor weakness. So that means that they're not always attacking a user, someone clicking on an email. It means they're looking for a vulnerability within your network and taking advantage of that. This is a new approach for them. A lot of times they were relying on an email campaign or clicking on a link on a website to get in. And what you're finding now is it's a lot more likely that they're actually coming in from the outside. And then the next bullet I'm going to spend a minute on. 80% of people that have been hit by ransomware were hit more than once. That means that someone got hit, they either paid it or fixed it, but then they got hit again. And 70% of those pay more the second time. So if they paid the first time, now that the ransomware guy knows he has a sucker on the hook, he charges them more the second time because he hasn't fixed whatever the vulnerabilities were that let him in the first time. 60% of attackers were in your network for up to 6 months. And that's just letting you know that once they're in, while they are probably putting ransomware on to make that their main attack vector, they could also be putting keyloggers on, waiting for people to type in social security numbers or credit card numbers, or they could be putting things to monitor or get access to your data and put it on the dark web. These are all things you have to be critically aware of because it's not just ransomware that's attacking you, but it's what these people can do once they're in. The next major outcome that we've seen a lot with disaster recovery planning, at least on our side, is power outages. Power outages are going across, like typically in California in the summer, when it's hot, you'll have brownouts. A lot of the places back east, when they have severe weather, or in the north, they'll get frost outs. And these kind of separate into various categories, but power outages are becoming a major hazard to data integrity and disaster recovery planning. And so you need to make sure that you're accounting for where your data centers are. If you have them in your building, do you have battery backups? Do you have generators? Are they tested? Are they ready? I would always recommend anyone who's putting their stuff in a data center to make sure it's SOC 2 compliant or SSAE 17 compliant, because you want to make sure those data centers have the ability to recover from a power outage. Natural disasters are on the rise, sadly. There are more natural disasters in 2022 per year, which is 9 of last year, than there have been for decades. On average, we were averaging 6 to 7 natural disasters a year throughout the world. And over the last couple of years, that number has gone up to 8 and now to 9. And so while 6 to 9 doesn't sound like a lot of difference, those 3 other natural disasters are affecting a much more broader range of geographic areas and having a larger financial impact on businesses and people. How to prepare. So let's get into this. The first thing you need to do to prepare for a disaster is to have a checklist. You don't know what you're preparing for if you don't know what you can lose. And that starts with that WAN diagram that's going through and finding out what your critical systems are that you want to recover. Then you have to have activation triggers. And an activation trigger is something that's going to happen that's going to cause you to enact your disaster recovery plan. So for example, it could be a server going down that you don't have a fault tolerance for, like there's no clustering or anything. You as the IT person or as the disaster team will have to decide if that server is critical enough to warrant enacting your disaster recovery plan. And that should be preset. Those terms and those triggers should be preset and defined based on the business criteria that you should be working on with the business units in your company. If you're a bank, you should be talking to the head of your teller lines. You should be talking to your loan officers. You should be talking to your management team to make sure that you have identified the triggers, and the business should decide the timelines for those triggers, not the technical IT team. That's very important, and I'm going to keep stressing that point. The business should decide, not the IT team. And so once you hit those activation triggers, you need to know how to enact your disaster recovery plan, who you're going to work with, how they're going to work, how you're going to communicate. Back in the day, we used to keep a 1-800 number on hand that we never used, we just had, so that if we had a disaster, we could send out that 1-800 number and have a conference call, and any of our employees could call in, get updates, get access, and we just kept the line open. Now there's things like Slack or Skype or Microsoft Teams that you can leverage for these types of things, but you should have a communication channel set aside just for disaster recovery. You need to predefine who's responsible for what, who their backup is. People are allowed to take vacations. You need to address in a regular meeting cycle if anybody changes roles, changes positions, leaves the company, comes to the company, how to redefine and make sure that you've recorded who is responsible for what. This is really important because a lot of times I see IT teams split up the work and they have one guy doing, let's say, VMware, but there's no one else that has the administrative access to back him up. And so he's the guy on vacation when a disaster hits and nobody knows what to do. So make sure you have a person that is ready to be responsible and their backup. A minimum of 5 scenarios should be tested on how you're going to respond. And those should range from simple things like a power outage or a server down to much more catastrophic things like an airplane crashed into your building. I know that sounds silly, but you should be planning for those type of things on how you're going to react, where people are going to work, how they're going to work. Along with disaster recovery planning, there's also the business continuity aspects and the risk assessments. Where are your IT people living? Where are your executives living? How they travel, how they work together? All of these things should be calculated in in your scenarios. When we worked in the banking industry, we had a lot of banks that you would not let executives fly on the same flight, for example. That's part of risk assessment and risk management, but that factors into how you plan your disaster recovery planning as well. And then last, but definitely not least, is the testing. You need to test all your scenarios at least once, hopefully regularly on a quarterly or annual basis, testing a scenario quarterly or all your scenarios within a year so that you're ready to react if you have a disaster. Now, obviously, you can't take your network down every year to do a full test, but knowing how to do a proof that shows your recovery capability without impacting production is just as important. So let's go into that pre-planning checklist a little. Hopefully every customer here that's talking to us or every potential customer has a BCP planning document. They've done their full business continuity planning, whereas disaster recovery is just a part. If you haven't, I recommend that you do. You should have your checklist on who you're going to call, how you're going to contact people. Today's day and age, that can be an online thing in your Microsoft Office, in your SharePoint or your Teams, or it can be literally a call tree. Hey, you call Bob, Bob will call Frank, Frank will call Alice, and so on and so forth. Clearly defining your roles and responsibilities. I put in here to procure a 1-800 number. That pre-planning, I'm not going to read all these off, but that pre-planning checklist goes through how you prepare and how you get set up so that when you have a disaster, the checklist you use for the disaster is ready to go. And you should have this kind of all planned out and regular meetings. Hopefully you have somebody who's in charge of your disaster recovery planning so that you know how to react and you know what steps to take. Management tasks. So when you're doing a disaster or when you have a disaster, there are multiple aspects that you have to take into account. It's not just recovering the systems and getting the users back up. Let's say you got ransomware. You have to have a management person on staff who's responsible for deciding, for example, do I communicate this with the public? Do I tell my customers? What do I tell my customers? How do I tell my customers? Did I lose data? Did data get access to the public, right? These are things that you have to account for, and making the IT person responsible for that is probably irresponsible. It should be someone on your executive team, some director or manager who's dedicated to have that public response. Okay, so I jumped around here a little, but before I go into Quorum and how we help with disaster recovery, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those management responses. We have a document called the Blueprint that is a baseline for how you set up a disaster recovery plan. It kind of walks through a lot of what I've talked about here today, and it helps you prepare and get ready for this. And if anyone would like a copy of that, I'm happy to provide it. Just reach out to Bill. The way Quorum handles disaster recovery is very similar to what I've been talking about, but of course, we're only handling the servers on the technical side of it. But we can help you to decide what needs to instantly be recovered versus what just needs to be protected. And so what we do is we take all of your servers, whether they're running from a public cloud or on-premise, and we back them up to the OnQ. And from that, we can provide instant recovery, file bare metal recovery, reporting, archiving, and an ability to test. And that's where I'm going to stop, is that testing. So what we can do with the Quorum product is, because we've protected all your servers, we have the ability to bring all of those servers up in a test environment so you could do a full disaster recovery test without affecting production. Now, this is important because this helps you, A, test the scenarios that we were talking about earlier, but B, it helps you become more practiced and more efficient so that if you have a disaster, you're more comfortable enacting that plan. The hardest part of a disaster recovery plan is starting it. And whether that's starting the planning or starting the initiation of you had a disaster, That is the key factor, is making that call. Quorum takes your servers, whether they're virtual or physical, and we can back them up to the OnQ appliance, and we can replicate that to the cloud, where we have dedicated Quorum Cloud to give you full disaster recovery in the cloud, or you can go to a remote server and a remote appliance at another location if you have one, and recover from there. Quorum includes a technology called VIP, which is VMware Integrated Protection, where we can back up at the VMware level and recover directly back to your VM hosts as well. Just adding that in. And so I know I buzzed through a lot of this, and I apologize for that, but I knew we got a late start, so I wanted to keep on track. If you have any questions, now would be a good time. Otherwise, Bill, I'll kind of hand it back to you if you've heard or have any questions.
Just some people really interested in that blueprint so far. One person just asked, do you OnQ support Hyper-V?
So we do support Hyper-V. We're not integrated with Hyper-V, but we support it with an agent on the VMs that we're protecting. We can back those up and we can recover them directly back to the OnQ or back to the cloud. And then we can use bare metal recovery features to put them back onto your new Hyper-V once you get the new hardware or fixed hardware. So going back into the disaster recovery planning thing, I'll just throw out a couple more details for people. Disaster recovery planning is one of those things that nobody likes to do. And I admit I don't like to do it either, but it is one of those things that will save your company if you have a disaster. And so building that plan is critical. Going through that blueprint is critical. Planning for disaster recovery and getting scenarios built. Good example of a scenario is buildings uninhabitable, or building is going to be long-term without power. What do you do? Because the questions you'll come up with is, where do users work? How do users work? What is the mechanism for them to connect? Do they all need laptops? Do they have remote access capabilities? All of these things kind of factor into these questions. Separate from disaster recovery, but very related, is risk management. And I would recommend that as you're building your business continuity plan, you go through a risk management assessment along with your DR assessment. Walking through your LAN-WAN diagram and making sure it's updated, but then saying, okay, if, pointing at whatever icon it is, firewall, switch, SAN, server, location, circuit, if this fails, what do I do? That mental walkthrough is a key factor in designing your disaster recovery plan, because it'll tell you where your weaknesses are.
That's great, Gabe. I just had one question. You were saying that some of these, requirements that the business has really shouldn't be dictated by the IT department. It's just kind of their job to see to meet them.
Sure.
So if I'm an IT professional and I'm unsure of like one of our business requirements on one of the aspects that we kind of ran through today, what should I do?
You should reach out to whoever's in charge of that aspect. If it's accounting, whoever's in charge of accounting, maybe it's the CFO. If you're in a manufacturing plant and it's some process that helps the manufacturing go along, who's in charge of that process? Most of these things have a manager, and so getting those business units, as I call them, those managers in place or in a room to talk about them usually helps. We used to have we used to go into customers and we'd have this funny story, because it kept happening over and over, where you'd go, okay, if the Exchange server goes out, what's an acceptable outage time? And the IT person would go, I could have it up in 2 hours. And the business person would go, I can't be down for 2 hours. And it would start the conversation of, okay, how do we get it up faster? What do we have to put in place? How do we recover and keep going? But it's this kind of a rule of two, whatever the business unit says, if you double it, it'll be half of what the IT person expected. So if the business person says, I got to be up in 10 minutes, and you double it, that's 20 minutes. And the IT person will probably come back and say, I could get it up in 40 minutes. It's just, it just kept happening over and over, depending on whatever it was. But the response time was usually 4 times whatever the business unit wanted. So something to be aware of. But that's why you need those business units in that meeting with you, because they're going to be telling you what the priorities are. I always recommend to get as high a level as you can in those meetings, even if it's up to the CEOs, depending on obviously the size of your company, because the higher the level is, the more global view they're going to have of the company to make calls on what critical paths to take. Any other questions? Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Someone just asked, when recovering on the OnQ data center, are there any ingress or egress fees?
So for Quorum, we don't charge any ingress or egress fees. Everything is kind of part of the package that we supply. We give people the ability to recover all of their servers with enough compute and horsepower. We also provide each customer with their own virtual firewall so that they can literally mimic their internal network. So when they come up and have to work remotely, it's as if they were in their company, right down to the IPs and the subnets. Good question.
Thank you. And a lot of people want to see the blueprint.
Yep, I bet that's what I'm hoping to get out of this, is to supply that to as many people as you need. So that's the key feature, is that blueprint kind of walks through an example of how to set this up. And it's been around for a long time. I'll be honest, the document's been around forever, but it's a great document to help you get started, because the process doesn't change. It's just how to apply it to your environment. It's very methodical.
Great, thank you. All right, I don't see any more questions, so I'll go ahead and say thanks to Gabe on behalf of everybody that joined, and thanks for joining us. All their great questions. That was always fun. And we'll get the blueprint out sent to everyone who asked, and we'll follow up with everyone just to get some feedback. And always great to have any follow-up questions, and make sure if there's any material or questions you had after the webinar that you get a chance to ask those. So thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.